This is 20 minutes of impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on making government work, my guest is Liane Randolph, former chair of the California Air Resources Board and former commissioner with the California Public Utilities Commission. Liane's going to describe how California's pioneering regulations for clean energy fulfilled the founding generation's goal of a government that would create a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. Liane was chair of California's Fair Political Practices Commission, attorney with Pillsbury and Winthrop, and was general counsel to the California Natural Resources Agency before becoming a commissioner in 2014 with the California Public Utilities Commission. In 2021, she became chair of the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, and since late in 2025, she's been in private practice and no doubt highly sought after. So, Liane, before we get into this more deeply, can you give our listeners just a quick overview of your work on California's Public Utilities Commission and with the Air Resources Board? And we'll get to the levers of change soon. But just to start off, is there something key about government processes that you learned in your work?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love the theme of this series. It's such an important conversation about how government supports making people's lives better in the United States. I'll start with basically describing the kind of the framework of how the Air Resources Board and the public utilities work together to advance California's climate policy. So the legislature back when Governor Schwarzenegger was governor of California adopted AB 32, which was a landmark climate law, and it required the Air Resources Board, which is the state's air regulator, to lay out a path to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At the time, it was 20% below 1990 levels. That ambition has been increased over the years. And it directed CARB to develop a scoping plan every 5 years to determine how to achieve those targets. And it's an economy-wide scoping plan. It looks at transportation, industry, energy, all of the sectors that produce greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, California also embarked on cleaning up its energy sector. And that really started with the Public Utilities Commission and the Renewables Portfolio Standard. And then subsequently, SB 100 was adopted that requires the state to get to 100% retail sales by 2045. So the agencies worked very closely with each other, with the California Energy Commission, with the California Independent System Operator, to plan for and deploy clean energy to meet the state's climate goals. And it's that framework that has allowed California to achieve first 20% below 1990 levels, and then is moving towards 40% below 1990 levels. And it achieved the 20% deadline ahead, 6 years ahead of schedule. The 40% deadline is coming up in 2030. And, we're doing everything as a state we can to meet that goal.
Now, one of the things you mentioned, you passed by it almost like it was an afterthought, but it seems to be one of the key things that has moved California forward, which is that the regulatory agencies work together. I know over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a great deal of progress. More and more of the leaders in the agencies have worked at that. Am I right about that? I think that's what I've been seeing and hearing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, in your original question, you sort of said, what did you learn about government through this process? And In the years that I have been working on these issues, it's very clear that close coordination is absolutely critical for success, and is really a large reason why California's climate policies have been successful. They've had bipartisan leadership, successive governors. The legislature has really carefully kept an eye on the administrative agencies and, as we'll talk about, makes tweaks to the legislation and changes things as we go along. And then the administrative agencies work really closely together to try to achieve the goals. Work with industry, with residents, with communities. But that close agency coordination, and the sort of detailed expertise that each agency has, trying to make sure that that expertise is shared, is a really important part of how these agencies work together.
And I agree with you about the bipartisan leadership. We just recently had California Energy Commission Chair David Hochschild on, and he pointed out that a lot of states like to take shots at California, and they like to characterize California as woke or something crazy like that. But the truth is that in many ways, the kickoff for all of California's energy policies and climate policies came from a Republican administration, didn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, back in the when CARB was formed back in the 70s, it was Reagan that signed that legislation. And then our climate leadership was kicked off by Governor Schwarzenegger, as I mentioned earlier. So this really has been a recognition that California is an incredibly unique place that needs to be protected. And the global impacts of climate change are acutely felt in California. And so first taking action to clean our air and clean our water, and then subsequently recognizing that it's important to create a climate program that creates policies that can be models, that can be exported to other states and countries, and that can be examples of how to deploy entire new industries in order to tackle the climate crisis.
I'm going to dig into that now. And we're going to get to the broader characterization of how government can work that you just gave an introduction to in a minute. But first, we're going to talk about something that was an immediate response in many ways, because the purpose of this podcast series is to highlight examples of when, where, how, and why government worked. Mm-hmm. And you suggested that a great example of that are the big legislative and regulatory actions California took after August 2020, when there was a heat wave that brought the power system right to the edge of blackouts, which, and I think you were on the commission at that time. So tell us about the problem that suddenly became very glaring, and tell us about the solution that the commission, the Utilities Commission, and the legislature then took on. And how did it turn out? What happened? I mean, I think there were some really good outcomes. Tell us about them.
Yeah. So, I'll start with something you probably talked to Chair Hochschild about, which is how successful renewable energy transition has been in California. Through, several years of policy, we are now at about 67% renewable energy. There are weeks and weeks of the year where we are powered solely by renewable energy. So that's a success story. But no success story happens without some challenges and some problems. And that's what happened in August of 2020. And in that, there was a massive west-wide heat wave. And that's an important detail because California does import some of its energy. And when you have a heat wave that's going up the coast, some of the resources that are coming into California don't participate in the market because they're serving the market in parts of the West that are not as high heat typically. So this was a multi-day high heat event, and we actually did experience load shed. We did have blackouts during this period. And so what happened was there was a lack of sufficient resources to serve. The independent system operator required the load serving entities to drop load, which resulted in customers whose power was shut off. And it was an event that had not happened in 20 years in California. So it was a very we've had, sort of issues around wildfire and having to shut off power preemptively to prevent wildfire, but this was the first time we had a system-wide issue in 20 years. So it was something that had to be addressed comprehensively and immediately. So from the very beginning, we immediately implemented a root cause analysis in just, I think the first version was 30 days afterwards. And then, we did a more detailed version. So this was the Public Utilities Commission, the Energy Commission, and the Independent System Operator. That root cause analysis revealed some challenges that needed to be addressed. It revealed that we needed to improve our resource planning efforts, to move faster, to bring resources online, to backfill for gas power plants that had been going off the system over the last few years, and to deal with the reduction in solar that happens at the end of the day when there's still a lot of demand, because solar goes up during the day and then goes down as the day ends, but it's still warm outside. People are still running their air conditioner, or they're still at the office, and so that demand continues. So this is the famous duck curve.
That was the first step. That was the first step, is the agencies working together again and identifying causes and identifying where solutions could be applied. So then what happened?
So then, and so the agencies were working very closely together. This is really detailed work. So each of the agencies immediately made changes. The independent system operator made changes to their market system, because one of the causes was resources that had bid into the market and not shown up. So they made process changes to their market. The PUC began a process to make process changes to its resource adequacy program, which is the program where people show how they're going to meet their resource needs. The Energy Commission worked on changing their planning process to take into account the fact that climate change is causing more of these high heat events, and that what they call the planning reserve margin, which is part of the resource adequacy program, and it says this is sort of the baseline of how much resources you're going to need. They increased that to ensure that resources would be available. And the governor and the legislature also stepped in and worked very closely together to make legislative changes. So the legislature created a strategic reliability reserve process, which included a central strategic reliability reserve managed by the California Department of Water Resources to procure emergency resources. But it also, the governor and the legislature also looked at some of the problems that were identified in the root cause analysis and looked at sort of longer term changes. So for instance, one of the challenges that was identified was that new renewable resources need to get online faster. So they created a quote unquote opt-in permitting process where renewable energy resources could go to the State Energy Commission instead of a local government and try to get their projects approved more quickly and streamline that process. The legislature also asked the agencies to increase the level of coordination and established a joint agency reliability report process where annually the agencies would have to do a deep dive into what are you seeing down the road for reliability? What challenges are you seeing? How are you going to stop them? They implemented a demand response program where the legislature appropriated funds to give private entities incentives to participate in a program where you would pull back on your energy usage when the system called upon you as a participant, and you would get compensated for that. So it was really looking at all of the levers, looking at the regulatory levers, looking at sort of legislative changes. Oh, one of the big things that was part of this was extending the life of California's last nuclear power plant. Diablo Canyon is a an aging plant that had been looking to move off the system, and the legislature said, you know what, this is great, clean energy. We're going to keep this online for longer. We're going to make some changes to state law to allow the plant to stay online longer. And that was an example where some legislators sort of had to get a little outside their comfort zone because they weren't sure that they wanted to continue a nuclear power plant. But all of this agency work and analysis showed that it was necessary. So it was all parts of government. And so in 2021, we had another lengthy high heat day. We called upon a lot of the demand response programs and flex alerts and avoided any kind of load shed again. There were no blackouts. And all the resources that the agencies ordered to be placed online were showing up in 2022, 2023, 2024. So we have not been at the edge of a reliability challenge since 2021. And so all of that together has worked to provide, like I said, 67% of renewable energy, over 17,000 megawatts of utility scale solar that helps the grid tackle these high heat events, and has just completely changed the conversation around reliability in California.
Yep. I had my power turned off during that first August 2020 event, so I'm very grateful to you and all the other people in the government. That's government working together and working quickly, because by 2021, 2022, the problem was addressed.
Yep.
It doesn't have to take forever. And I want to stress the point that all of those actions created enormous opportunities in the private sector. And that's the second thing you told me you wanted to talk about in terms of showing how regulatory actions, legislative actions, government actions, as it were, can create private sector markets. And you said you had some other examples. Now, we don't have a whole lot of time, and I really want to get into this other part of the story. So I wonder if you could pick one or maybe two examples and show us how this action by the government, effective action by the government, leads to growth in the private sector, which of course creates wealth and opportunity and jobs and all kinds of other good things that allow people now who are working in the private sector to pay these high gas prices that are coming out of this war in Iran.
Right. So I'll give you two related examples in my work from the California Air Resources Board. And one is famously how California has led the nation in electric vehicles. The Air Resources Board has been regulating mobile sources of pollution since its inception, has successfully reduced um, ozone and NOx and particulate matter um, uh, for years. And, we were the agency that mandated the catalytic converter. We removed lead from gasoline. It's been an incredibly successful program. Um, and as the technology has progressed, it became very clear that there was an opportunity for electric vehicles to play a greater role in cleaning up the air. And so over the years, the Air Resources Board adopted rules that required the deployment of electric vehicles. And one of the ways that that program became successful was they not only required the companies to produce electric vehicles, but they also created a crediting system where if a company was getting behind in its obligations and another company was ahead in its obligations, then they could trade the fact that one company had built 10 electric vehicles and one company had only built four, and the companies could trade credits. And that famously allowed Tesla to figure out a way to produce just electric vehicles. They had the technology to do it. But the crediting system sort of created this market opportunity that allowed them to scale up, market them to the public, and meet the needs at the time of the legacy automakers, but also to really build a market and create jobs at a manufacturing facility in California that had been used by the legacy automakers and they had moved out. And so many of those vehicles were built in California for many years, and they still are now.
Yeah, even though we've had some setbacks in federal policy, California is still, um, I don't know, providing jobs, providing economic growth to the state through the EV market.
Right. And then a related example is the low carbon fuel standard, which is a climate program that requires producers of fuel in California, because California is both extracts oil and produces a lot of refined product. Um, and it required those companies to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuels they produced. And the way they could do that is by producing cleaner fuels themselves, or once again, by if other companies came up with cleaner fuels, they could pay them, they could buy credits that the cleaner fuel companies were producing. And so that has allowed for a lot of innovation around both cleaner fuels for vehicles, but also one of those fuels is electricity. So utility companies producing electricity can actually earn the credits,
Mm.
and they can sell credits to companies that are producing higher carbon fuels. And that program actually funded quite a bit of the um, electric utility charging infrastructure, in addition to, investments the utilities themselves made and charging companies made. This crediting system allowed charging companies to put DC fast charging in and use these credits to help defray the cost of those kind of big upfront infrastructure investments to build big fast charging plazas. And it continues innovations in sustainable aviation fuel. It supports innovations in sort of ways to manage other pollutants like methane, and to turn those into fuel. So it's been a huge opportunity to create jobs and to advance technology, and create funding to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's exactly the way carbon markets are supposed to work. And the California's is a carbon market is a great example of how moving ahead with these kinds of new ideas creates this opportunity and creates more innovation. And then that innovation leads to, it's like a chain of events. That innovation leads to breakthroughs that create new opportunities in the private sector, more jobs, more revenues. It sort of goes on and on. Um, we don't have a whole lot of time left, Leanne. I want to get to one last question. I don't know if you can make this a shorter answer, but it would be helpful. Um, the last question that I like to ask in this series is, what are the key levers of change that you've seen that can expand our understanding of how a government can serve its citizens?
So I think I would say policy consistency is really important. And we talked about this earlier, right? Sort of having this in my sector, it's this very consistent goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but that can apply to other policies as well. Ways to solve California's housing challenges, right? Housing is very unaffordable in California, and the legislature and the governor have really been working together, sort of figuring out levers to increase the amount and the speed of housing development in the state, and sort of being really clear about that goal, and willing to identify the right regulatory steps, because the regulatory agencies are the ones that really are going to be implementing this both at the state and at the local level, figuring out how to increase that level of coordination so that either the state agencies or the state and local agencies are working together consistently to communicate and smooth over the bumps in the road. That to me is the most important thing about government, is just really trying to work together as closely as possible.
And again, I'm going to say it one more time, and then our listeners will be relieved to know that I'm not going to say it anymore today. That cooperation at the government level leads to opportunities in the private sector. And so that's how a government works to benefit people who need help and people who are looking for opportunities in the private sector. Do you think that's right, Leanne?
Absolutely. I will say, I can't tell you how many times folks in the private sector have expressed frustration to me when the government agencies aren't talking to each other. So one of my big goals was to be like, okay, I'm just going to pick up the phone and I'm going to call them and figure out, what are we doing that's inconsistent, and try to solve that problem. And so that level of communication with the private sector as well is very important.
Okay. That's a great place to put it. I want to thank my guest, Liane Randolph, former chair of the California Air Resources Board and former commissioner with the California Public Utilities Commission. She described ways that she has seen government serve as an ally to its citizens. I also want to thank my producer, Melissa Brown, and as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.